Good morning, everyone. We're just going to take a couple minutes while everybody streams in to the room, but we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Okay, it looks like the numbers are holding steady, at least for now. So I'm going to get started. So good afternoon. My name is Danielle Landry, and I'm the stream lead for research on social determinants of health at the Canada Excellence Research Chair, or CERC, in Health Equity and Community Wellbeing at Toronto Metropolitan University. Just by way of an image description, I am a white woman with brown medium length hair, and I'm wearing a cream colored sweater, and I'm seated behind a white wall with a black and white painting on the wall. Today's event is virtual and it will be recorded. It is being recorded and it's available to view on our website shortly. So thank you for joining us today for our speaker series. Today's event is entitled Transforming My Madness into International Mad Movement Activism, a Personal to Political Manic-Depressive Journey by Matthew Jackman and Dr. Poole. Live captioning is provided, so please select the CC button on your Zoom menu bar to see those captions. Now, before we get started on the event, I want to start by offering a land acknowledgement. So as a settler living and working in Toronto, Canada, I recognize that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and that we are all treaty people. The land I'm situated on today, known as Scarborough, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I am thankful to live and work on this land, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm grateful to all the land defenders, water protectors, and Indigenous knowledge keepers who, through their actions, are showing us a way forward to fight climate change and to protect the environment. At the CERC in Health Equity and Community Wellbeing, we commit to supporting Indigenous communities by honoring the principles of OCAP, CARE principles, and the National Inuit Strategy on Research, and by establishing meaningful, engaged partnerships and relationships with our Indigenous community partners. Now, just a little bit about the CERC and Health Equity and Community Wellbeing. So we are a transformative research initiative, and that employs engaged community partnership approach to expand our understanding, practice, and delivery of health outcomes for all members of our communities. Through collaboration with a network of healthcare providers, healthcare institutions rather, service providers, and civil society organizations, our research program aims for a paradigm shift, one that challenges a siloed, expert-driven approach to health and well-being and moves instead to a community-engaged, preventative model of well-being. Uniquely applying a critical disability lens, the research program aims to not only reduce health disparities that are inextricable from their social contexts, but to embed community knowledge into healthcare institutions and systems and models of delivery. So in talking about MAD activism today, for me, it's a little hard to know where to start. I've spent the last couple of years gathering, reading through, and digitizing an archive of MAD activism in Ontario from the consumer survivor-led organizations. So I feel so steeped in the material histories of these small and large actions that it makes it really hard to neatly summarize the scope and the nature of it. To be comprehensive at a global scale here feels quite impossible, but I'd like to provide a bit of context, particularly for those in the audience who might be less familiar with the histories of MAD activism. Just going to take a sip of coffee because I'm losing my voice here too. I also want to flag this as a rare moment. because it's not often, at least not until very recently, that there would be an international event featuring all MAD identified speakers, myself included, speaking on the political practices of MAD people and their mobilizing of their activism and how that informs and drives scholarship in the area of MAD studies. For those who aren't familiar, MAD studies is an emerging field, one rooted in community organizing, MAD politics, and an ethics of unruliness. Collective organizing has informed and remains integral to this field of study. MAD studies is by its very nature a collective enterprise with no singular form. An emergent global field, what makes MAD studies distinct is it ambitiously aims for creating a paradigm shift while holding space both inside of academia, where MAD people have been historically excluded, and in activist community at once. MAD studies remains linked to contemporary MAD movement efforts led by MAD people and their allies. Taking up an interdisciplinary and multivocal practice, MAD studies unsettles many of the taken for granted ways that knowledge gets produced, validated, and consumed. So you might think of it as like a meta-curriculum of unlearning, meaning it encourages us to question what we think we already know, engage with uncertainty, and open up space for multiple ways of knowing. Always political, this field pushes other disciplines to generate knowledge related to madness in more accessible, democratic, and collective ways. It challenges dominant biomedical approaches to madness by actively decentering psi-based frameworks. Starting from and centering the collective knowledges produced by MAD people, MAD studies looks out to the social, the political, economic, and environmental forces that affect MAD people. It considers how saneism, a deeply embedded system of discrimination and oppression of people who have received a mental health diagnosis or are perceived to be mentally ill, operates in everyday work and life. And this marks a transformative shift because the nature of MAD studies as an activist and a scholarly endeavor, which retains the tensions of a bridge. Now, in the talk, you'll know that Matt is going to be speaking about the consumer survivor ex-patient movement. And this is what gets now more commonly referred to as the MAD movement. And this movement, if you're not familiar, emerged during the 1960s and early 1970s as a loosely organized social movement led by ex-mental patients. And what began as a decentralized grassroots movement across the global north is now international in scope, but it remains fragmented and loosely coordinated. In her book, Talking Back to Psychiatry, the Consumer Survivor Ex-Patient Movement, written in 2005, American sociologist Linda Morrison described this movement as, and I quote, a loose coalition of advocacy and activist groups whose members engage in numerous activities designed to promote mutual support, rights protection, alternatives, advocacy, and information flow that will enhance empowerment and choice for people whose lives have been affected by psychiatry. These terms, consumer, survivor, or psychiatric survivor, and ex-patient, refer to some of those self-identifiers taken up by people within the movement at different points in time. This is not to the exclusion of other terms, but rather signals the politics of each moment. And just to clarify, there is no singular MAD politic. Rather, MAD politics are intersectional and committed to social change and epistemic justice. As stated by Gorman and Lefrancois, important sources of MAD theory come from the collective interventions that challenge the boundaries and authority of neoliberal post-secondary institutions. Interventions and advocacy by MAD people that challenge institutions of higher education and upend dominant biomedical framings of mental health generate knowledge that in turn contributes to the field of MAD studies. So hopefully that provides some context for those who are less familiar with this topic area. But as we move through the talk, if you have lingering questions about any of the terms that were used or are being used, I would ask that you hold on to those or note them down, and we'd be happy to discuss them at the end during the Q&A. So now to start our event, I am thrilled to introduce our guests. Matthew Jackman is a doctoral researcher at the Center for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney, undertaking a National Disability Insurance Scheme participant-funded PhD focused on lived experience theory and practice in mental health. Their research investigates the global mapping, history, activism, and future direction of the user, refuser, consumer, psychiatric or trauma survivor, ex-patient and inmate, and MAD movement. Using qualitative methods, including World Health Organization regional-based focus groups and didactic interviews with CSXM leaders. Their PhD addresses gaps in the movement's collective aims, values, principles, sustainability, and future direction. Grounded in MAD studies, Matthew approaches their work as an insider-outsider, MAD researcher, and member of the MAD Pride movement. Matthew's academic background includes a Bachelor of Social Work honors from Monash University, a postgraduate certificate in MAD Studies from Queen Margaret University, a Master of Advanced Social Work from the University of Melbourne, and an international diploma in mental health, human rights, and the law from the Indian Law Society. They also hold a certificate number 4 in training and assessment from Plenty Training. In addition to their doctoral research, Matthew is a consultant with the World Health Organization, focusing on meaningful engagement in non-communicable diseases. Their work emphasizes the integration of lived experience perspectives into global mental health and disability frameworks. Currently, they are interning with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, contributing to disability inclusion initiatives with a focus on invisible disabilities. Recognized as Australia's National Mental Health Advocate of the Year in 2020 by Mental Health Australia, Matthew brings a wealth of experience in social work, forensic mental health, and disability services. Their lived experience of madness informs their approach, which sees madness as a dangerous gift to be harnessed for the betterment of the CSXM community and the advancement of MAD activism. Matthew's work bridges academic research, policy advocacy, and grassroots activism, aiming to create sustainable, inclusive, and equitable systems that honor and amplify the voices of those with lived experience. Dr. Jennifer Poole is a white settler. She is also Associate Professor at TMU School of Social Work, where her work sits at the confluence of madness and grief. She grounds herself in approaches that challenge colonialism, white supremacy, and carcerality, and those that center connection, co-creation, access, and justice. Her research is always collaborative, with current projects focusing on disenfranchised loss and grief, sanism, and the interruption of colonialism in education. Past projects have focused on precarious work and health, transplantation, how mental health is disciplined in the helping professions, and critical analyses of mental health recovery. A published poet, she loves to teach and learn, supports graduate students at multiple universities, and has long been involved in community mutual aid initiatives. I am pleased to welcome Matthew and Jen, but I will ask Matthew to now start our event today.
Great, thank you, Danielle, for that very kind introduction. And we start off with a bang with this image of my euphoric mind. Just for accessibility purposes, I am a white person. I've got bleach blonde hair that probably needs to be cut a little at this point. I've got headphones on. I'm wearing a white t-shirt with a black background. So as Danielle mentioned, I'm Matthew Jackman, and today I'll be talking about transforming my madness into international mad movement activism and looking at the personal to political journey through manic depression, which is the terminology I use today, but I have used other terms divergently in the past. And I'll be having a question and answer with Dr. Jen Poole after the presentation. Taranjeet, next slide, please. Beautiful, thank you. And just my own land acknowledgement of where I'm based. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I gather today here. It's very early in the morning in Melbourne. It's 2 a.m. at the moment and very hot. It's 30 degrees. I'd like to also acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Wurrung and Burrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And also extend my respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander folk and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, culture, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And just a minor trigger warning, I will be speaking to themes of obviously mental health, suicide, trauma, grief and loss. I won't be delving into them in any great depth, but just to let you all know, feel free to take a break, switch off if anything becomes a trigger. As we all know, people with lived living experience, we never know what comes up for us sometimes in the moment in the body. So I just wanted to let you all know in preparation for today. Next slide, please. So just briefly, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of where I'm located and my positionality and how I've come to this political journey in experiencing periods of madness myself through my siblings, through family, through intergenerational experiences of madness, and how that's led me to mad activism. Danielle's done a good job of summarising MAD studies and the MAD movement and the various identities that intersect. So I'll briefly fly over those and then speak to how the journey of living with madness, and I continue to do that until today, how that has led me to take an activist stance and look at the socio-political and cultural and spiritual dimensions of my experience and resist the biological and psychological individualistic ways that have been put upon me by the psychiatric system, and engaging with that over the last few years. Then I'll briefly touch on my research as mad activism and my hopes for the future before delving into a dialogue with Jen. Next slide, please, Tarandeep. So in terms of positionality, I think it's so important in spaces that are political, that are critical, in really thinking about reflexively who you are and the privilege and oppression and advantages and disadvantages that come to that you bring to the world and that you're situated in. I am an Australian citizen, 34 years of age. I'm also a white settler. I'm currently unemployed and a PhD student, so I'm sure a couple of you can relate. Postgraduate educated, I'm queer and I identify as non-binary, and I'll speak a bit about how that coalesced with madness later on. I grew up in pretty significant poverty, in family violence, child abuse and neglect, public housing, and the child welfare and foster care system. Through that time, I lost my mother to suicide, and grew up as a young carer, helping to raise my two younger siblings in an ongoing traumatic environment. Where there were a lot of complex systems of grief and loss intergenerationally as a result of that experience. I like to say episodically able-bodied and minded. It depends on what's going on in my life in terms of madness, in terms of institutionalization and social exclusion, and of course side effects impacting my own movement and mobility, which I'm sure many of us can relate to. And have been defined through various labels as mentally ill, which I will talk about resisting as we go on. Next slide, please, Tarandeep, thank you. So in terms of thinking about my whole self, we're all complex, multifaceted beings, and I like to think of the trilogy of lived and living, learned and laboured experiences. And I like to bring a complexity lens. I also like to bring a lens of or a perspective of humility, and that I don't have all the answers, and that there are many truths to a particular phenomena or question or way of being. And I really embrace alternatives. I embrace, being critiqued and having dialogue around the ways that we are in the world. So in terms of my, lived and living experience, I've already spoken a bit about that, but psychiatry has labelled me, or the psych system through the DSM, with bipolar disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, general post-traumatic stress disorder, and attention hyperactive deficit disorder. I've been in hospital for on and off for about a year of my life. I've had access opportunities at times in my life when I've had economic resource through public and private services. I've been a user or refuser of electroconvulsive therapy and currently have stayed out of the clinical system by using psychosocial disability supports, quite thankfully. We've already spoken a bit about my learned experience. What wasn't mentioned is that I've trained as a peer worker. I started my career in peer work and peer support. I did a lot of peer advocacy work, particularly in forensic mental health when I first started my career, and was an avid trainer in lots of different peer work approaches, such as intentional peer support. In terms of some of my work and laboured experiences, I've worked in child protection or child welfare, forensic mental health, and the prison system in mental health, which is quite harrowing. I've worked in disability, particularly psychosocial disability and neurodivergent spaces as an advisor to the court on supports. And I've worked with veterans. And the last several years of my career, I've been an educator and an activist, predominantly in the MAD space, MAD studies and MAD activism space. Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to what that looks like in terms of being an artist as well today, which I'm excited to share with you all. Next slide, please. So here's some lovely images of my family at varying points in time. It's interesting, you can see the stark contrast of my mum on the left when I was quite young. We look very much alike, and I feel very much a spiritual, a deep connection with who she is and whom I embody today, hence my pronouns, they, them, incorporating the two of us. But it's important to know that, you know, I come to this space as someone whose life has been shaped by madness and trauma and struggle for belonging. My journey into lived experience work, MAD studies and MAD activism has not been a linear journey, as I know it's not for many of us, and has been stitched together by the grief, you know, resilience, rage, and deep need to find meaning beyond the experiences that I went through. My earliest memory of madness really wasn't from within myself. It was witnessing my mother and her experiences. When I was 3, she experienced what the system called postnatal depression and then psychosis after the birth of my younger brother, who was 3 years younger. For me as a child, it wasn't obviously a clinical term or a medical term. It was watching the person who was supposed to hold me unravel. You know, it was confusing, it was scary and fearful, and had an unspoken understanding about something being wrong, even though no one had the words for it. So there's a lot of shame, stigma, silencing in that space. So really for me, my relationship with madness began not really as an abstract concept, but as something that was quite intimate, quite fragile, and quite terrifying at first. Next slide, please. So here we are, a little bit older, and you can see the Furby. I don't know if anyone remembers Furbies, but a Furby, which is the middle picture, which is a picture of like a talking, I don't even know what they are, like a talking rabbit. Was a gift that was given to my foster siblings, who were the biological children of my foster parents. And I remember not receiving one for Christmas and not receiving a gift. I remember feeling very othered and excluded as a young child in foster care. And obviously with my mother being able to function in the ways that society expected of her, I had to step up into that role of being a young carer. Typically, there was abuse always in the household and neglect from one or the other of my caregivers. I tried to hold space and compassion, but as we know, complex trauma and attachment issues and relationship difficulties are a lifelong journey of healing, of reparation, and in many ways reconciliation. My survival instincts, though, kicked in pretty early and developed skills that adults might admire without understanding the cost of that as an adult now. I became pretty adept, though, at systems thinking and anticipating, what needed to be done in the moment at home, mastering complex problem solving and figuring out how to navigate different crises, whether emotional, practical, or psychological. The strengths came with shadows, though, and masked my own emotions, which led to a lot of ongoing patterns of avoidance to cope, particularly in feeling overwhelmed by a lot of complex trauma and grief. I did lose my mother when in foster care. I was 9 to suicide. I still remember that day. I only really remember crying and using it as a way to connect with people, which said a lot about how disconnected I was as a 9-year-old at school. I felt very othered even prior to that. So yeah, as I mentioned, the Furby was a reminder of my disconnection and exclusion as a child, and not feeling a sense of belonging in foster care, where there was also a lot of abuse and bullying, unfortunately. As I grew older, though, trauma didn't just come from what had happened at home. It was also in the systems that had failed me, including the mental health system and the child welfare system, that felt at times like I was suffocating and drowning. And the image there of the radio towers is just where my step siblings lived, and I used to look out to the mountains and wonder how I could get there. It was about 30 kilometers away, and I'd always look out thinking that there was hope. So it just said that I was clearly a very lonely child, a very disconnected and confused child, seeking understanding amongst all the confusion. Next slide, please. So moving on into my adolescence, again, it was difficult given that we were in pretty significant poverty. We still had child protection in and around the family. And then I was dealing with my sexuality, which did not help at all. Growing up in quite a regional environment, a low socioeconomic public school, there was a lot of homophobia to the point where people were assaulted. There was one person that had come out and it just wasn't a safe space to be queer, and my family were very homophobic, and one of my caregivers had mentioned that gay people were diseased, and that discourse has obviously come from psychiatry, before that religion. So you could, I clearly had a critical psychiatry mind in hand with these experiences. And I should mention that, my human experiences of responses of feeling unsafe or anxious or depressed, as labeled by psychiatry, were really adaptations to surviving that were later pathologized. Next slide, please. So moving on into my sort of early adulthood, I ended up studying social work. I fell into it. I actually started studying food science, and I failed a few units when I came out. I was too busy partying and trying to find a sense of community and belonging. But I was attracted to supporting other people and had a keen eye for sort of critical approaches, given I'd had a lot of lived experience of what it felt like around disadvantage, around structures, around injustice, and around oppression. So it felt like, social sciences were just a really neat fit for what I'd been through. I got it, I embodied it. I felt like I'd had community for the first time in coming out and finding a queer community, although I never really felt a deep connection or could deeply relate to others. And through my training, I ended up working in forensic mental health when I graduated, where I worked briefly as a social worker with on a women's unit, but mostly as a consumer consultant, which are essentially peer systemic advocates that run advisory groups to improve services from the consumer perspective. So that was really my entry point into what we call the consumer movement in Australia. Next slide, please. So through all of that, I somehow managed to prevail or escape the psychiatric system until my sort of early to mid-20s. And some bullying at work in that forensic environment led me to attempting suicide. I was very, very flat and hopeless for many, many, many months, and started having thoughts about my mum, given that we're at the same age. That episode, unfortunately, led to a manic episode. I was hospitalized for about 3 months and on very high levels of antidepressants, which I actually think tipped me into having a manic episode as a side effect. So as we've sort of touched on, the biomedical model diagnoses and treats those observable symptoms on the surface rather than the root causes. And we've already talked about, or I've already talked about a number of them, for me being poverty, family violence, gender norms, sexuality, unsustainable working conditions, housing conditions. I really like the image of Elise Ruriani here. We need to dig deeper on the right, where we need to address mental health with our social justice and intersectional spade. We need to dig beneath the biomedical surface of the DSM, of individualization, of the medical model and big pharma, to address those social, cultural, spiritual and structural determinants that really do drive a lot of our despair, distress, madness, however you term your experiences. So I understood pretty quickly that my experiences of trauma, grief, loss and isolation were being reduced to labels, and were being responded to with individualistic responses such as hospitalization, psychiatric medication, electroconvulsive therapy, and psychotherapy, which can be harmful, as we know. Next slide, please. So through those experiences and some pretty poor experiences with nursing staff, I have to say, and some psychiatrists, I started to become quite resistant. I'd sort of been trained to be an advocate. I'd worked in systemic advocacy and lived experience spaces in sort of the pointy end in forensic mental health. And I really sort of came to this thought of, particularly through a manic episode of, reclamation and resistance, and seeing my madness as wisdom through periods of crisis, or what the system was defining as depression or mania, which I describe more in emotional terms rather than those reductionist terms. So the manic episode really was a catalyst for a lot of revelation and insight, which I'll speak to on the next slide. Next one, please, Tarandeep. Thank you. So in terms of my insight, wisdom and revelations that have come through my experiences of madness, basically the walls had broken down, the social norms had broken down, my eyes had opened to the world's possibilities, the system's faults, my experiences of high energy and at times of depressive states offered really unique insights. So during elevated states, or euphoric states as I would term them, I had a heightened sense of creativity, innovation, emotional intensity, which fueled a lot of expression, both artistically but also linguistically. And obviously, responded to a lot of other despair through through those depressive states. Through the depressive ones, it was more emotional insight and introspection, self-awareness and storytelling that I gained from those insights. And I remember this quote. I remember seeing Blade Runner 2049 at the time, and I remember being profoundly impacted by dying for the right cause is the most human thing we can do, in the sense of living, living for the right cause. If that's someone's choice, is the most human thing we can do. I found that really profound, and that's shaped a lot of my activism. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to speak too much to this because Danielle did provide us with some context to what's known as the MAD movement. As we've heard, it's a social and political movement. It's grounded in consumers of either ex-patient movements and a critique of traditional psychiatric or biomedical practices, and the pathologization of people's human experiences, their emotionality, their distress, in offering alternative understandings, and also, being driven more by mad studies and mad pride, understanding madness as a human diversity rather than as a deficit or illness or problem. So the MAD movement's often seen as an umbrella term for some of those identities that Danielle has referred to, which I will briefly touch on the next slide. I'm just aware of time. So I'm just going to very briefly go through these identities. Consumer really refers to a more reformist approach of people consuming or service using and advocating for choice and control within the current system without disrupting the status quo. Psych survivors typically refer to themselves as having been harmed or experiencing coercion as a result of the system and taking a more radical stance to whether that's abolition or transformative approaches. The ex-patient inmate identity is around highlighting people's past experiences of institutionalization, particularly before deinstitutionalization occurred. And acknowledging that history, and ex-inmate referring more specifically to involuntary confinement in psychiatric institutions and prisons, and MAD being a reclaimed identity and a form of diversity, resistance, and political identity that does have some alignment with, of course, the MAD Pride movement. And often in the literature at the moment, it appears that there's a bit of a correlation with taking a more radical intersectional approach to abolition. But again, these things mean different things, and there's no one truth. I think that will be the takeaway. There's no one truth to anything, and it's important to hold that space for dialogue. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, some of the key elements. Danielle's already wonderfully touched on this, but the movement's key elements or key ingredients are around resisting psychiatric oppression, reclaiming that identity, addressing epistemic justice, where lived experience knowledge is valued, as is all other knowledges. And as we know in the system, often lived experience is relegated to the bottom of the epistemic kind of hierarchy, with medicine and psychiatry at the top, along with sort of legal discourse. It's usually, survivor-led activism, human rights and social justice based, and I'd argue disability justice based around collective liberation and cross-movement solidarity building. MAD Studies has really driven this space in the last sort of 2 decades, and we're seeing a lot of shifts and changes around MAD Studies as a field, academic field, but also as a field of activism. And an abolitionist and decolonial perspective around dismantling systems and looking at envisioning alternatives, whilst also challenging Western psychiatry and centering local and Indigenous knowledges, where we see a lot of, global mental health expansion of Western models to the global South. So there's a real resistance to that within this as a key ingredient. And we've spoken about intersectionality. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, I came to MAD Studies actually through my intentional peer support training through one of my instructors. I think Danielle's neatly spoken to a lot of these points around advancing lived expertise, around prioritising lived experiences and alternative ways of knowing and being of those that have been identified as or labelled as MAD, as mentally ill, or have taken on their own identities of MAD and survivorship. And really critique the academic co-option of lived expertise as well. Next slide, please. I'll get into the fun stuff. What this has looked like, though, in terms of activism for me, is both at a local level and in sort of community and creativity and collective resistance, and in reclaiming my madness as valuable and transformative. So whether that's through attending MAD camps with other MAD folk, peer spaces for community building, and finding, radical ways to both self-accept, but also find ways to challenge systems from those spaces. MAD Pride activism. I attended my first MAD Pride rally and protest actually last year in London, which was wonderful. And it was a beautiful celebration of MAD identity. and just challenging saneism and stigma, as we heard about before, and advocating for human rights, and mad art. So I've explored this through a disability justice organisation, through Schizzy Inc., and exploring madness and advocacy through comedy, through song, through writing, theatre, cabaret. You can see a few photos there of me sort of on the stage. One of them I was playing a psychiatrist. You can imagine how fun that was. Next slide, please. The madness has also brought me to the global stage, often through actually periods of madness where I've had a lot of grand ideas for change, systems change, which have obviously come from childhood responses to having to navigate complex situations. I never felt so clear through my states of madness, and it sort of led me to the WHO, or World Mental Health World Health Organization Mental Health Gap Forum, where I initially was the inaugural Western Pacific Regional Lead for the Global Mental Health Peer Network, and sort of proudly brought in a lot of Pacifica voices which weren't being heard around how they conceptualize and understood mental health. I won't speak too much to any of that. I think Danielle has spoken to that. Next slide, please. Initially, I would say, probably in the reformist camp before really encountering a better understanding of, I'd say, psych survivor and radical and abolitionist perspectives within the MAD movement space, mostly because I just wasn't aware of them. In Australia, we have a very co-opted movement where most of our activists and advocates are employed within the system, and are unable to carry out radical activism and activity. So we very rarely refer to psychiatric survivor studies or activism. Even MAD studies is very much maligned, and it's very much a consumer focus. It's a reformist focus within the status quo of the system in Australia. So I guess I took that on. I was indoctrinated myself. And through that experience, I sort of spoke to the need at WHO around the UN and WHO having a collective responsibility to embrace lived experience experts and integrate really into strategic analysis and engaging the various user and carer networks to ensure a truly interdisciplinary perspective. Because at that time, there was very little lived experience representation, particularly at those high level meetings. Next slide, please. In terms of my work and activism and where that's taken me, I've been quite involved in a number of these documents. So there's several sort of technical packages and frameworks, the first being around peer support and mental health services, and highlighting some wonderful case studies of peer models, alternatives to the dominant psych approach that are working quite well around the world in that peer support mental health service package in the first one. The second one was my involvement in sort of looking at promoting person-centered and right-based approaches and looking at case studies around the world, such as the Trieste model, which is a non-carceral model of supporting people in distress. So a lot of it was about kind of informing WHO what was going on around the world, where there were alternatives happening in the psych survivor and MAD space that were peer-led and anti-carceral. And then recently I was involved in the intention to action series for people with non-communicable diseases. So WHO still uses that language, unfortunately, but they include mental health and neurological conditions as part of that and refer to that language specifically. That co-production work with, and I should say I've been involved with, hundreds and hundreds of other advocates, activists in this space to help co-design, co-produce and co-implement a lot of these frameworks. But this People Power series led to the development of the WHO framework for meaningful engagement, which was actually a massive step. It was a framework and really policy guidance for countries to develop and be driven by lived expertise across all non-communicable diseases, including mental health. and really provided a framework for addressing epistemic injustice and being led by co-design and co-production, which is quite a foreign concept in a lot of parts of the world. But of course, it's happening naturally in a lot of parts of the world too. And we'll probably speak to, looking at decolonization and decolonial approaches. Just the next slide, please. So in this particular document, I shared a lot of my own experiences and how I conceptualize madness. I sort of use the term bipolar. You've sometimes got to be reformist to be radical at times. I'm a bit of an idealistic pragmatist, but I did describe my bipolar as being part of who I am, it being a spiritual gift that's been brought about through interpersonal, family, community, and societal trauma. And I'd argue responses to grief, isolation, poverty, you could go on, human experiences, It's a special gift in the face of consistent adversity and constant hypervigilance, and a gift that requires harnessing. So I was quite proud that they published that, because I thought that that was pretty radical and alternative for them to be thinking about different ways of understanding madness as responses to social, cultural, spiritual, and structural determinants. And by structural, I mean sort of political and economic and material dimensions. Next slide, please. Just the last couple. So in this particular document, I talked about madness being reclaimed, like queer, mads, often been used historically in a derogatory and pathologizing way to other and discriminate. It's about acknowledging that there are some amazing things to come out of madness. That's not to say it's the experience for everyone. Some people find it extremely destructive. Some people, it's for better, for worse, and everything in between. Again, multiple truths, and very open to holding space for that. For me, I've used MAD really to reclaim that shame that's been put upon me in society, and it's given me empowerment, to subvert people's consciousness and help realize that we're all human beings at the end of the day. I wouldn't want anything else but to be me. And as I've said, it's part of who I am. And it's a human response often to, particularly mania, responses to rage, injustice, anger, and depression, on the other hand, is often, guilt, grief, sadness, very human experiences. Next slide, please. Danielle's already briefly touched on my PhD, which I'm lagging behind on a little at the moment. I've been on mad time myself lately, and on Struggle Street. It's been 40 degrees here in Australia, and I've recently had surgery. So I'm, yes, a little behind, but essentially I'm looking at the international MAD movement, what that looks like, what does it mean, what's its current state and future trajectory, and kind of wanting to hear from activists, advocates, leaders in what that means to them in each region, each WHO region. So really keen to hear from global North and South contexts around what this actually means, because it does mean different things in different structural and cultural contexts in particular. The only change is that I'm interviewing folks now rather than focus grouping. Next slide, please. I think it's the final slide. So in terms of my vision for the future that I reported in this particular document around the framework for meaningful engagement of people with lived experience, I've talked about needing natural healers in our communities, needing peer support, natural peer support that just exists without needing formal systems and services, which may or may not include strong families, whether that's families of choice or origin, and strong communities. Basically, we need relationships, we need each other. We need social justice, allied health or alternatives, non-diagnostic ways of and methods to supporting us mad folk in distress, or what other terms people use. We are the data, we are the science, people with lived experience, and I can't stand it when people say there's data and there's lived experience. There's no science without us, unfortunately. So it's really important to break that down, and that binary that we often hear. The reality of the mental health system, of course, is that it's colonized, very patriarchal historically, and continues to be, and has entrenched those of us that are oppressed in continuing oppressive conditions through psych services. And that's for those that have access to that. Everything's often blamed individualistically on the individual. You know, they're depressed, suicidal, they've got bipolar, schizophrenic, all those sorts of awful blaming languages. When the reality is that for many of us, we're living in unjust and distressing conditions, resulting in distress and expressions of distress or trauma or grief, isolation that we experience. And for me, I felt like we needed a whole of government or whole of society response, including, often sustainable economic models and systems, but also beyond that, we need people movements to be, leading empathy, love, compassion, be culturally grounded in different contexts around what works for people, community driven, and socially justice-based communities where we talk about power and share power. So there were some of my visions for the future in thinking about what mad activism really meant to me in terms of societal change. The next slide's just the references. And that's it from me in terms of, I think there's just a thank you slide. But yeah, thank you for listening to my talk. I'm sorry, I know I went a little bit over. I did mention beforehand, it's always a 100-meter sprint when you're talking about reflexivity, yourself, your life, and then what you've done. But anyway, thank you for listening. And yeah, looking forward to having a chat with Jen.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Matthew. That was a really thoughtful and rich presentation, and I'm looking forward to engaging with it further. I'm going to invite Dr. Jennifer Poole to provide a response.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Danielle. For description, folks, I am a white woman. My pronouns are she, her. I've got brown and gray hair, and I've got big, round, black-rimmed glasses. And behind me are a lot of art pieces, including those done by my nibblings at 6, 7, and 10 years old. Matthew, first of all, let me just say a deep thank you. I'm thanking you from the Jen that is present here today, and also the young carer that felt with your words. So we have been encouraged to model exactly what you and Danielle just talked about, and to do things a little bit differently in this next portion of today. And so the first place I want to come back to and attend to is you. Because often we do these presentations and, with the fancy technology, and we're not supposed to feel anything, right? We're supposed to almost roboticize ourselves. So yeah, the first thing I want to do is to come back to you and say, how you doing over there? How does it feel to have just shared all that you did? Some tender plot spots, some like unruly spots, to quote Danielle, some of the big, some of the small. Yeah, if you could just talk to us a little bit about how that felt.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned, recently, in terms of, bringing your whole self and being, reflexive and kind of honoring who I am. I have been struggling myself lately. I've come back from Canada, as you both know, and time zones often impact my my mood, and I think along with having surgery and having my sleep impacted, I haven't been in like the most amazing space myself, but in many ways some of those experiences of distress, reflection, just sitting with, have really opened up space, I think, for a lot of healing. I've been really sitting with a lot of, ironically, I can speak to what I've gone through, but sometimes, as you say, not feel it or perform it. But I've been sitting with a lot of that lately, on my own, in spaces that aren't like this. And yeah, just realizing like the journey that I'm on and continue to be on, and realizing that it's okay to continue to not have your shit together, so to speak. And just like embrace the messiness that comes with distress, with madness. Yeah, so I think that and speaking through all of that, it just I'm quite proud, really. It reminds me of like what I've come through. It reminds me of the community and solidarity that I've been able to find, even though sometimes I still don't feel that connection, and I'm sure you can imagine why, given what I've been through. So yeah, it's a mix of emotions, I think. Yeah, it's a mix of emotions, but I'm really proud and really grateful that I have people like yourselves and those that are here listening that are open to listening, sharing, dialoguing. Yeah, I think this is my community. I found it. So yeah, I'm really like grateful and happy that I've kind of come to this space, and I think that that's where my passion kind of lies. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and if you just to continue to be transparent, like you need to get a drink, you need to stand up, you need to stretch, please do so, because you've just shared so much with us. So much has come out of you. So I want to make sure you're putting something back in first and foremost.
Thanks, Jen.
Okay. So the next place I would like to go is, again, to invite you to go back to any spots in your presentation where you thought, oh, I wish I had a little bit more time. I wish I had a little bit more room to perhaps dig in a bit more. Because sometimes when we're speaking, we're doing the thing, the performance, and you had the slides and you had the notes. Connections are being made kind of behind the scenes. Is there anything that you would like to go back to and add or stretch, not tear, stretch, and just relax into with us right now?
Yeah, I think there's such an importance for me around, I guess, the languaging of our experiences and how we come to that languaging. For me, and for my belief, it's really deeply personal, which is why I mentioned, holding kind of a pluralist, multiple truths perspective. I'm really open to how people describe and understand their experiences of whatever that may be, mental health, illness, disability, madness. And that's something that I hope, we continue to dialogue about and share. Just because we have these terms now doesn't mean that they're not going to change throughout time and history and context, and they do. We know that happens. Sometimes they ebb and flow, they go back and forth. So I think just holding space for, I guess, some level of like intellectual humility, which is a really important concept for me, and just being grounded in not knowing, in the unknowing, and leaning into what another person's truth is. I think that that's a really important concept for me in this space, because Danielle and I have talked about, identity politics and division, and some of the movement's struggles around having unification around philosophy or values or principles. And that's just because we're all different humans. And this is a really complicated and contested space. And with madness, as you say, there's like an unruliness. There's a defiance of normalcy. And yeah, a resistance to like the unknown. And the other thing with madness for me is like just being able to sit with the mystery is really important. I think that to me really is about embracing madness, is just like holding, what's happened to holding space for like the unknown and mystery. And I think that there's some beauty in that, in madness. So I think, yeah, there's some things that I think contribute to, the movement more broadly, around some of maybe the barriers, both interpersonally and structurally. But for me, I really just hold space for that opening up, of conversation and dialogue, and honoring people's own ways of understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully that all made
Yeah.
sense. That was a bit of I feel like I went on a tangent then.
I love a good tangent, Matt. I have to say, like, some of my most favorite journeys have been tangential.
Yeah.
But that's how we roll in this space as well, right? In multiple directions, all at the same time.
I was going to say, I think it was Lamar Jarrell Bruce, talks about the, honoring the mad rantings and ravings. So let's be here for that.
And that is a perfect segue, because the way that you describe what's really important to you in this work, the humility, the multiplicities, right? The unruliness. There's room in all of this. There's space, there's changeability. It's not pinned down, it's not flattened out, right? Psi discourses like to flatten. They like to pin. They're like, this is that diagnosis. This is that human being's trajectory from that point. There isn't a lot of room or topography, right? So I'm curious, and there was a slide where you had a photo of various books and things, and then the references quickly at the end. I'm curious if you could take us back to the moments and the teachers that you've had that created that spaciness, that sort of room for you to find a place or places in this work. And this is for folks who are listening who are like, what is this mad studies thing? And how do I start? And maybe, and I'm just remembering my very young version of myself when I was listening to Lucy Costa speak in 1993, thinking, what is that? How did you just describe my life? And where do I start? So can you take us back to those moments where perhaps it was a what is that? And please tell me more. And who were your teachers?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. Well, my entry, I think I mentioned earlier about my entry point into lived experience work or consumer work was in forensic mental health. And there was a really, I guess, intersectional feminist in the senior consumer consultant role who really brought a lot of, I guess, critical analysis to her work, and that informed me of not just the consumer movement and what that meant in terms of a movement in Australia around, peers, around recovery, but then more broadly exploring what that looked like internationally. So Julie Dempsey, who is, an award-winning, she's done a lot of wonderful work, particularly for women and inpatient units and women's safety, gender safety and on inpatient units, really taught me the importance of, human rights in complicated spaces and terrains like forensic mental health, where there's a lot of, risk aversion and institutionalization. So I really learned in the pointy end what these sort of concepts meant within this consumer movement. And she was just so staunchly and authentically herself. And I think because she came with those intersections and understanding kind of a critical approach and analysis to understanding, privilege and oppression and how that operates, how power operates, I think that really helped intersect, not with the languaging of madness at that point, but with mental health or lived experience. Because as I said, within the consumer movement, it was much more reformist in terms of the languaging. And then I really learned about MAD studies as I mentioned, through intentional peer support through Flick Gray, who's a wonderful MAD scholar. mad activist. Flick and I attend Skitsy Inc. and she's wonderful to be around in those comedy spaces. Such wisdom. She knows how to really make fun of the system in a really lighthearted and poetic way. But she introduced me to a more radical and kind of abolitionist perspective that critiqued the consumer movement as I knew it then, and some of the problems of lived experience and co-option into the status quo, and started getting me to think not just about, improving people's human rights within the system, but is this the right system at all? And for me, I was obviously connecting the dots between my own experiences. I felt like I had experiences that, were very obviously medicalized, when in reality they were all based around culture, around or around social determinants, I should say, and around, my worldview, around my spirituality, and around the material conditions of my life and the politics that determines that. So I think I started, looking at the literature and listening to Flick and other, mad kind of scholars and activists who were on the periphery, I'd have to say, and probably we still are in many ways in Australia, that kind of, helped me to learn and understand and teach. But to be honest, a lot of it's also just, it's such a digital space. And I think that's one thing around this movement, is that and we've talked a little bit about like physical spaces diminishing, whether that's due to COVID funding for us mad folk or psych survivors. So the digital space really has been a grounding for that. And people like yourself, Jen, and Danielle, and, Lucy and Jeffrey Room and Bren Lefrancois, and, people that I would read about or see in forums or see in groups and social media, a lot of that kind of came through that digital kind of connection and community that really is, it very rarely exists physically, at least in my context.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for taking us back there. And Danielle, your work has, been so instrumental in citational justice, like who are the teachers? And as you said, Matthew, like they're not necessarily the ones writing, or not necessarily the ones that are ever going to write, right? But they're the doers. So many gifts, which leads me to my very last landing point with you. And Matthew, when you were here in Treaty 13 and we got to hang out, and it was cold and you were getting ready to go home, and we were talking about your work, I remember at the very same time I was reading this little gem of a book, The Serviceberry by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who some folks on the call will know. You would have read Breeding Sweetgrass. You will know that Dr. Kimmerer is an Indigenous scientist. And something struck me so strongly, Matt, when you were talking about your work, and today, the notion of madness as a gift. And I wanted to read like a piece from this book. And for those of you who haven't read it, it is really a meditation on the abundance of something called the serviceberry. And Dr. Kimmerer thinking through what the serviceberry and its harvest has to teach us all of us treaty people. And I will read this part and then we'll come back to you, Matthew, because it feels like very consonant with how you are positioning madness as a gift. And it is this. Dr. Kimmerer writes, as the berries plunked into my bucket, I was thinking about what I do with them all. I dropped some off for friends and neighbors, and I'd certainly fill the freezer for Juneberry muffins in February. This problem, quote unquote, of deciding what to do with abundance reminds me of a report shared by Lewis Hyde in his essential book, The Gift, that linguist Danielle Everett wrote as he was learning from my fellow hunter-gatherers in the Brazilian rainforest. He observes that a hunter had brought home a sizable animal, far too much to be eaten by his family. The researcher asked how he would store the excess. The hunter was puzzled by the question. Store? Why would we do that? Instead, he sent out an invitation to a feast. This seemed like, to Cy folks, maladaptive behavior. Who asked again, why didn't the hunter store the meat for himself? And the hunter responded, I store the meat in the belly of my brother. So Dr. Kimmerer writes, I feel a great debt to this teacher for these words. There beats the heart of gift economies, an antecedent alternative to market economies, another way of organizing ourselves to sustain life. In a gift economy, wealth and knowledge are understood as having enough to share, and the practice for dealing with abundance, excess energy, is to give it away. In fact, status is determined not by how much one accumulates, by how much one gives away one's gifts to share. So, with those words about forever gift economies that have always been here in multiple nations for millennia, what do you think gift economies or the notion of gifting has to offer madness and mad studies, in your opinion, Matt?
Yeah, well, I think understanding the notion of a gift, I guess again, there can be multiple truths for folk, and it can be comfortable, it can be challenging. As you've mentioned, there can be unexpected lessons and pushing for growth in ways that we might not anticipate. I think for me, and gift economies and madness, I think for me, it's really been about embracing like the humanity that you live with, and the empathy, the humility, the compassion that comes with living and breathing in the mind, body, soul, and being able to pass on that gift, the gift being you. You know, I feel like for me, madness and mad studies, a lot of it is about rehumanizing, you know, and I feel like the gift is about being able to touch, you know, be able to, you know, touch others through, you know, the spirit of who we are. And I think that that's something that has resonated with me in my activism through, you know, truth telling or storytelling and sharing and dialogue with so many people. So many conversations like with yourself and others. I think that's where the gift lies, in sort of, you know, mutual aid, in supporting one another, in building connection and relationality. For me, that's where madness lies, in extending humanness and the importance of relationality in a world that's increasingly neoliberal and capitalist, and driving us towards humanity being seen as a commodity and a product and something to consume. I feel like madness brings us back to humanity and the importance of each other and survival as the gift. That's what it means for me.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you for those collective meditations. And I will unmute myself and pass this back to Danielle.
I want to say thank you as well for those thoughtful reflections, Jen, because it's funny, I have the service berry on my nightstand as well. If I had taken a second, I could have run to grab it. And it really does resonate. And that passage was like kind of a really lovely way of resonating these ideas, I think, out more broadly through time and space. So that was really lovely. And I absolutely agree. It resonates for me as well. And so thank you, Matt, and you, Dr. Jen Poole, as well, for your time and your insights. This is a really generative conversation. It's going to have me thinking for quite a while. I also want to thank Angie, our live captioner, and the whole CERC Health Equity team for making this event run. And also thank you to everyone here for attending, for engaging in our talk and generating those questions as well. Our next event that we're going to be hosting will be on March 5th, and that's with Dr. Eliza Chandler and the team from the Office of Social Innovation at Toronto Metropolitan University. So please check out our website for more information on the location and the registration details for that upcoming event, along with past recordings from other events, and this one will be posted in future. So thank you again for attending the event, and once more, thank you, Matt, for this really engaging, thoughtful, and moving talk.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Appreciate the safe space and community space. It's time for bed. It's 4 a.m.
Absolutely.
Speaking of authenticity.
Get
All
some
right,
rest.
take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Danielle.
much.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Tarandeep. See you, everyone.
Thank you.